I think the visit broadly kind of had rave reviews from both sides of the political spectrum.
The window of what is acceptable and allowed in terms of how you speak about politics and your opponents has so shifted.
Has America, have everyone kind of become desensitized to the fact that gun violence or, attacks like this at major events are now just par for the course in American society? Hi, guys. Good to see you both in this week, I suppose, which has been all about what we're about every day, which is the relationship between the US and the UK, given that we work for the BBC in DC.
Yeah, I would have to say a very different sort of week. There was a lot more color and pomp and pageantry at the White House than I'm used to. It was really kind of unlike anything I've seen in the 3 years I've been at the White House.
And so interesting to see Washington transformed to welcome the royal couple and just how excited, seeing some of these members of Congress who have been, veterans in the halls of the Capitol for years, getting really excited to see the king and queen. And I think that is a testament, especially with the king's address to Congress, to what that relationship means to many of them, even though it is under strain right now.
It's so interesting you mentioned that to me because I was fascinated by all the images that, very high flying people were posting on their social media who were at the garden party that the British Embassy hosted for the King and Queen on Monday. And it was people just jostling to get as near as they possibly could to the King and Queen, Democrats standing shoulder to shoulder with Republicans, all trying to just get that photograph, exchange those few words, get that handshake.
And it was really rare to see. I think the visit broadly kind of had rave reviews from both sides of the political spectrum in the US, and that's something we don't see very often. There's not much that people in Washington seem to agree upon, and this kind of seemed like a moment where everyone was very enthused to see the king. I think many people interpreted the king's speech to Congress quite differently, but they still ended up coming away from it very positive about it, which I think kind of speaks to the strength of the King's speech and just what kind of a masterful move of soft diplomacy this ended up being.
That's what I found actually most interesting, particularly about the king's remarks to Congress, is that Republicans and Democrats I spoke to came away from this with very different readings. For the
Mm.
Republicans, one lawmaker telling me, I didn't hear anything in that speech that would indicate that there are strains in the UK US ties. And yet, Democrats I've spoken to have said, listen to what the king said about Ukraine, listen to what the king said about the Royal Navy, about the environment. All of these things are really opposite to many points of President Trump's agenda. And yet he managed to deliver that message in a way that didn't seem to ruffle President Trump's feathers.
And in a way that caused rounds of applause from both Republicans and Democrats to some of the things that they wouldn't ordinarily applaud to at all. And for me, the stinger was when the King was talking about the Magna Carta and how, so
Yeah.
much of American modern law is based on that codified by Supreme Court rulings. And the line he said that executive power should be subject to checks and balances. And the Democrats went absolutely crazy applauding that. And indeed, many of the Republicans did as well. Speaking to Democrats afterwards, they said, I mean, we had Congressman Richie Neal on the special program we had. He said, no, I interpreted that absolutely as a jibe at President Trump, that he is the executive power that is not subject to checks and balances. When I spoke to Republicans about it, they had interpreted as a salute to Congress, that Congress had a role of checks and balances on any executive power, and they weren't interpreting it as a direct slight on the current president.
I think quite a few Republicans that have spoken out after the speech also kind of put it in contrast to the faults they see with Prime Minister Keir Starmer. One congressman said, for example, that he came away with the speech thinking that the king is someone who's proud of Britain and proud of British history, as opposed to what he termed being kind of a leftist weenie was his phrase for Keir Starmer. So I think it was quite interesting to see that also there was kind of American impressions rather of British domestic policy, and they kind of separated the king completely from that equation. I thought it was quite interesting to see those kind of reactions. But I think everyone was very happy, especially President Trump.
Yeah, one analyst said to me this week, President Trump is the compartmentalizer in chief. He's someone who can clearly separate out what he sees as a truly strong and deep friendship with the king. I mean, how many times did he praise the king to no end and the queen this week, saying they're excellent people? And he even said, I wish we had someone like this in our country, which I'm sure didn't have everyone so pleased in the US. There's a reason we don't have a monarch here, of course, but I think he means more the character of the king and what he sees as, again, a deep friendship. And yet, I think he can look at that apart from what he sees as real weak leadership from the Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, who, of course, is under his own intense domestic pressure at the moment over the firing or the appointing originally of the former UK ambassador to the US, Lord Peter Mandelson, and his ties to the late sex offender Jeffrey Epstein. But he has equally come under that pressure from President Trump. As we know, we've talked about it in recent weeks on the pod that President Trump has been very critical of the British Prime Minister. And I think even with this very successful royal visit, that pressure is not going to change. And I think about just the way he talks about some of the other European leaders of NATO countries, where he says, oh, they're great people, they're wonderful people, especially if he's with them one on one. But their policies he can criticize and take apart. And I think he does see them as separate things.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the British government as well in advance and during this visit were really eagerly briefing that, the king is the head of state. He's not the head of government. They're very different. You can have very warm relationships between the king and the president, and a whole other relationship on a political level between the king and the prime minister. But when you look at some of the reaction to this visit below the political level, I was listening to a bit of Ben Shapiro's pod. He's, of course, a very influential conservative right wing podcast show host. He has millions and millions of followers. He actually put out an episode that said something along the lines of King Charles, shut the F up. And he had interpreted the speech as a lecture to the American people about all these things that were great about the UK and not so great about America. So I thought that was quite an interesting take on everything that we had seen. I suppose the real tell will come with the next post on Truth Social that we see from President Trump when the King and Queen are wheels up and they're no longer, in this country, and the president is no longer hosting them. And when he's going to give some sort of final opinion on how the trip went and what it means now.
During the actual appearance at the White House, when Trump was speaking, he very much stuck to the script, which is
Mm.
something off the top of my head I only recall really seeing a few times in which he didn't deviate kind of at all from the written script. But then when he was in more kind of those informal settings, when he was in the Oval Office with reporters following that, I think it was the day after, then you already started to see those comments. He said, for example, that the king would have wanted Great Britain to participate in the war in Iran without providing any evidence, of course. I think, he was very much kind of in his best behavior, and he's not someone shy about sharing his opinions about anything or anyone.
Yeah, I think about it as the sheen almost wearing off from the pomp and pageantry of the king and queen's visit. And what is left at the end of that? Well, as things stand now, President Trump is still engaged, albeit in a ceasefire with Iran, in this ongoing war with Iran. The Strait of Hormuz is still closed. The US continues its blockade, which, as we've discussed here in the past, President Trump deems as very effective and says he's satisfied with the status quo. But the Iranians, keep saying all they need to do is cry uncle. And they haven't given way in negotiations. And that leaves President Trump again fairly alone on the world stage when it comes to his allies who have still refused to join him in this fight against Iran. And that includes the UK. And so, as the King and Queen will be back in the UK in the coming weeks, and President Trump is facing again the Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, with whom he has differences over this war, I wonder how quickly that message will pivot again.
And we saw the king address that a number of times in that speech to Congress, didn't we? Talking about the international community, talking about strong alliances, talking at length about NATO, about the transatlantic relationship between Europe and the US, not just the UK, that there were all these other partners, including those in the Commonwealth, which was, I think a pretty direct reference to Canada, because obviously the relationship there is quite strained between the US and Canada. Again, at that top table personal level between the Prime Minister Mark Carney and President Trump. And so, I think the king didn't pull his punches in that regard. So I'd be really interested to know. And of course, we all will, we'll never find out. But in those private moments, did the king press those points? Because although he has to be above politics as the head of state, this visit came on the say so of the British government. His speeches would have been written largely by the British government with some input from the king, but all of the words had to be approved and were gone over each of them several times. So, did the king carry on with that type of conversation when they were behind closed doors, particularly, I think, around the issue of the Royal Navy and the British troops? Of course, the king, a veteran of the Royal Navy and something that's very close to his heart. I think he would have been putting up quite a strong defense of that.
And although we don't know what was said in that meeting when the doors closed, I think if there was any messenger that the British government could have hoped for, it would be the king. Just on a personal level, Trump is such a committed Anglophile, and he's such a fan of the royal family. Even his kind of criticism of Prince Harry, for example, has been quite muted compared to his criticism of other public figures. I think the president seemed to me to be much more receptive to that discussion with the king, and just based on the remarks he made before the king arrived, than he would be necessarily with a foreign prime minister or a foreign president who comes to the Oval Office and does a kind of much more straight to business meeting of the kind we see quite often. I think the president, just given his enthusiasm for British culture and the institution of the monarchy, I think he's much more receptive to hearing from King Charles than he is from many other public figures.
Yeah, and there were a few really important gifts and gestures made by the king, but you have to remember that, of course, just before the king and queen arrived here, this came at a point of another moment of massive pressure here in the US, political pressure, and also another sign of political violence coming to the surface here in the US. And, all of us, the three of us, were at the White House Correspondents' Dinner. And after that terrible incident there were real questions as to whether the royal visit would go ahead. The palace worked with the White House on this and making sure that they felt the security arrangements for the king and queen's visit were adequate and that the visit could go ahead without any issues. But it was just a reminder again that, this comes at such a fraught time for the president. We've seen that through the course of this week with just a number of stories, these massive political developments, from the Supreme Court ruling on redistricting in Louisiana to another indictment of James Comey, all of this happening in the backdrop of this pomp and pageantry.
Yeah, I felt, I don't know about you guys, but I was at the White House. I was at on Capitol Hill. I was at Arlington Cemetery, a few of the spots that the King was at, and I felt there was an extra level of nervousness in the wake of the shooting on Saturday night. Thankfully everyone was fine, and bar one Secret Service agent, nobody was injured, and all of the law enforcement personnel, acted so quickly, and that individual never got into the ballroom where we were all seated. But nevertheless, it was an attack. That person is now charged with an assassination attempt on President Trump. It's the third that he has suffered during this last couple of years. And I felt that there was a nervousness around. I mean, even on Capitol Hill the other day, ahead of the King's arrival, and all the barricades and security were there. A few people had stopped trying to, I guess, take a photo of the King arriving. And the personnel around really screamed at them to move on. You cannot stop here. Keep going, keep going, keep going. They just didn't want anyone anywhere in any sort of place that perhaps it wouldn't be a controlled environment. And I do think that was hanging over the whole visit, not least because most of the people who were reporting on the visit were there on Saturday night and, have all been working nonstop ever since. And, it must be front and center for the president as well.
I completely agree. I think part of that nervousness was the fact that many of those congressmen, for example, or many of the White House staff that were there to receive the king were also
Mm.
at the dinner. And there actually was a very brief, I'm not sure I want to call it a security incident, but there was an attempted fence climbing at the White House during the king's visit. And just from what I've heard afterwards, the response was a little more aggressive and a little stronger than your average fence climber. That's something that happens, with some
Regularly.
regularity. I just think the nervousness also kind of was in part because now it's brought back this conversation about political violence in the wake of that incident at the Hilton in Washington. Of course, there was Charlie Kirk, and there's been several other incidents, and that's a conversation that I think, unfortunately, for the White House and for members of Congress, was taking place literally the day before the king arrived in the United
Yeah.
States. That's kind of a very uncomfortable conversation to have, especially when you have such a prominent foreign guest.
Yeah, absolutely. Not only, of course, the question of how political violence happens in this country, but the rhetoric that is used and this kind of finger pointing on both sides of the aisle. Democrats saying, well, that rhetoric is coming right from the top. Look at the language President Trump himself has used just, I think, a week and a half ago now, saying he would wipe out an entire civilization in Iran. And of course, how he has spoken about his critics or who he considers to be his opponents. And then, of course, criticisms of President Trump. We heard many of his supporters saying, look, if you call the president a Nazi, if you call him Hitler, if you say he is a terrorist, that is inspiring more people to take up violence against who they see as their political opponents, including President Trump. And I think what is difficult to see underneath all of this kind of back and forth that we've had this week, and we've had it in our programs, of course, with Democrat and Republican strategists, as we usually do, is just how the window of what is acceptable and allowed in terms of how you speak about politics and your opponents has so shifted. I just was remarking, listening to the Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth talking in his first hearing on Capitol Hill since the war had began, talking about Democrats and some Republicans in Congress who oppose the war in Iran being the biggest adversary at this point. And so, not the Iranian regime, but indeed those lawmakers. And those are the types of statements that I think we've started to hear more and more, and perhaps started to normalize in a way. But at the same time, they are obviously a real escalation of words.
What I've thought notable this week as well in the wake of that attack is usually a debate springs up about gun control, about access to guns, who has them, where they came from, where they got them. But the debate in the immediate aftermath of this attack has been about security and, as you guys are saying, political rhetoric. Should there have been more security at the hotel? Should it have been in a different place? There hasn't been a conversation about this individual purchasing the guns, which we're told, according to what's been presented by the acting Attorney General Todd Blanche and the US Attorney here in DC, Janine Pirro, is that they were purchased in California, and that this individual who's accused, Cole Allen, then travelled by train right across the country. But yet the conversation has focused on the security at the hotel. And, we've all been there for a few years now. The security, to my mind anyway, and obviously I'm not an expert in these matters, but as the consumer experience, let's say, of security was the same. You just showed a ticket that
Yeah.
doesn't have your name on it to get into the hotel. You didn't show any ID, and you went through those metal detectors pretty close to the ballroom, relatively speaking. I mean, it is a floor up, but it's still pretty close to the doorway. I mean, where the individual was intercepted was the top of a staircase. When you come down to the bottom of those stairs, you are at the door. You don't have to walk across a big long distance of a lobby or anything like that. But yet the security worked. The law enforcement personnel that were there, even though he sprinted through them, according to that video that the president shared, they did intercept him. They pinned him down. They did fire some shots. They took his shirt off to make sure he didn't have any kind of ballistics vest on or anything. So it worked. The president wasn't hit. No one in the room was hit. The vice president, all the cabinet secretaries, in addition to all the members of Congress, and then the lowly journalists, of course. Um, but it's just been funny to note that that's where the conversation has sat and not about the gun rights, which is what we usually expect. And to me, I've been asking myself the question, has America, have everyone kind of become desensitized to the fact that gun violence or, attacks like this at major events are now just par for the course in American society?
And I think we're kind of beginning to see the conversation kind of as an extension of the conversation you just mentioned, the conversation about what events are actually a good idea and what
Yeah.
is possible going forward. I had the misfortune, I suppose, of being at the assassination attempt in Butler, Pennsylvania, when Trump was on the campaign as well. And immediately after that, you saw a review about whether outdoor rallies were a good idea. And I think especially now as we're ramping up to a midterm. And then eventually to the following election, there's a conversation to be had, and I think a White House official told us this week is already being had about kind of reviewing what events the president and other senior officials would be like. And I think there's a separate conversation happening on Capitol Hill because, I didn't think about this as at the time, but many of the rank and file congressmen and members of Congress rather that were in the room, they didn't get the same kind of immediate
No.
evacuation as the more senior level cabinet members or the senior leadership of the Republican Party was there. Many of them were kind of waiting around with some of us, and I've read an account this morning of Jared Moskowitz, a Democrat. He had to ask another congressman if he could kind of tag along as he was being removed from the ballroom. And then, of course, there's the conversation about whether President Trump needs to even be at such events. We heard him almost immediately start to talk about the building a ballroom at the White House, which is not clear how that would have helped because it was a private event of which he was a guest. But there's all sorts of these questions now about what events actually make sense for prominent politicians to take part in, and what more can be done. I've been thinking about that hallway a lot actually. This morning, I didn't realize this at the time, but I found out I had just missed the incident by a few minutes because I had gone to the restroom, and someone I met on the way there ended up being stuck in the hallway, kind of where Wolf Blitzer was. So I think
Mm.
all those steps are going to have to be reviewed before any sort of big public. Well, it wasn't public, but big event takes place in which the president and cabinet members are all there.
Yeah, and that interesting anecdote that you mentioned about Jared Moskowitz, the Democrat from Florida, I think he was tagging along with Steve Scalise, who's the House Majority Whip, who, by the way,
Mm.
was on hand for a shooting at I think it was a practice for a congressional baseball game in 2017. So just a reminder of the continuing pattern of gun violence and how elected officials have said that they are more at risk now, particularly with the sharpening of political rhetoric, than they have been in the past. That's something we've heard lawmakers raising alarm bells about. But I think what is important to note is two things. One, as you both have said, look, the security worked in the Hilton, of course, because this individual was stopped. At the same time, with a little bit more planning and coordination, had it not been just one person, had it been several armed people, it could have been a very, very, or far more serious incident. Of course, it was very serious as it was. Somebody with the intent to assassinate the president and members of his cabinet. But he was thankfully stopped, and save for that Secret Service agent, as you said, Katrina, who was injured, there were no further injuries, but it could have been much worse. And that's why these questions about security are so critical. And I think number two, President Trump said this himself right after the incident. And he said, you can create a secure perimeter, but if you have, as he called him, one whack job, one person intent on doing harm as a lone wolf, somebody like the alleged shooter here, who we understand didn't have a criminal record, it is very difficult to stop that person. And so that brings you back to the question, do you then prevent the president from doing indoor events or outdoor events after a certain size? As we know, Butler, Pennsylvania was an outdoor rally. That is not something that I anticipate the president will be willing to do. He loves those rallies. He really gains strength and inspiration from them. And as the midterms creep up on us, we have heard that the White House wants to send him out on the road, and I can't imagine that they would dial that back in any significant way.
We are unfortunately out of time for today, but it's been a pleasure as always seeing you guys. If you enjoyed this episode of The President's Path, then like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. We would love to hear from you. So please leave us a comment below or email us on path@bbc.co.uk.